April 15th, 1912. Night had settled over the Atlantic. The mighty Titanic carved silently through the dark waters. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Until... At 11:40 p.m., an iceberg tore into the ship's steel hull. That single collision would change the course of history. Minutes later, deep within the lowest decks of the Titanic, one man was about to make the most important decision of his life. His name was Joseph Bell. And this is not the story of a famous hero. It is the story of a man history quietly forgot. These were his final 30 minutes. Joseph Bell had devoted his life to the sea. For years, he had served aboard countless ships. He knew the sound of steel, the scent of steam, the rhythm of powerful engines. And he knew, better than anyone, when a ship had truly begun to die. When he joined the Titanic, he understood this was far more than just another ship. This was the pride of humanity, the largest, the most powerful, and the ship the world believed could never sink. But that night, the sea did not care about what people believed. The ship that had shaken the pier as she departed, the ship whose shadow had darkened the sea, a floating empire drifting across the Atlantic, was slowly surrendering to the darkness below. A few minutes had passed since the collision. Then, the first report reached the engine room. The news from the boiler rooms was far from reassuring. The forward boiler room was flooding rapidly. Bell did not hesitate for a single moment. Together with his fellow engineers, he made his way to the damaged compartment. What he found was deeply alarming. The freezing waters of the Atlantic were pouring relentlessly through the steel hull. The pumps were running at full capacity, but the water rushing in was far greater than they could pump out. Bell listened carefully to every report from his engineers. Each new update made the situation even worse, because the water was no longer confined to a single compartment. One after another, it began spilling into the next watertight compartments. In that moment, Joseph Bell realized that the fate of the Titanic had already begun to unfold. But this was not a disaster that only Joseph Bell had witnessed. Soon after, the Titanic's chief naval architect, Thomas Andrews, made his way to the damaged compartments. One by one, he inspected the flooded sections. He listened carefully to the engineers' reports. Then, he began to calculate. The conclusion was even worse than he had feared. Beneath the Titanic were watertight compartments, separated by massive steel bulkheads. The ship had been designed to survive with no more than 4 compartments flooded. But the water had already reached the 5th compartment. That was the point of no return for the Titanic. Without wasting a second, Andrews went straight to Captain Edward Smith. What he was about to say would change the fate of everyone on board. His calculations revealed the terrible truth. The Titanic could no longer be saved. Captain Smith did not hesitate. He ordered the crew to prepare the lifeboats. Crew members began knocking on every cabin door. Passengers were instructed to come up to the boat deck. Most of them believed it was only a precaution. No one could have imagined that within a few hours, the largest passenger liner in the world would disappear beneath the icy waters of the Atlantic. But in the engine room, not a single man left his post. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell turned to his crew. By then, there was no saving the ship. Only one thing still mattered. The longer the ship's electrical system remained operational, the more time the people on deck would have. If the pumps stopped, the water would rise much faster. If the engines fell silent, the Titanic would surrender to her fate far sooner. That was why Joseph Bell and his crew remained at their stations until the very end. In the engine room, time was running out. With every passing minute, the water kept rising. Joseph Bell listened carefully to every report while doing everything he could to keep the ship's vital systems alive. The men in the engine room worked without stopping, but the freezing waters of the Atlantic kept pouring in minute by minute. Every pump that remained in operation bought them only a little more time, but the water never stopped. Conditions inside the engine room were growing worse with every passing minute. As the water continued to rise, one boiler after another was forced out of service. Joseph Bell and his crew were racing against time to keep the remaining systems alive. Every boiler that fell silent reduced the ship's power just a little more. And with every passing minute, the battle inside the engine room became even harder. But Joseph Bell never left his post, because he knew every minute won inside the engine room meant hope for the hundreds of people above. The water kept rising. In some places, it had already reached knee level. Yet Joseph Bell and his crew kept working against impossible odds. Chaos had taken over the engine room. On one side, the freezing waters of the Atlantic were swallowing the steel hull. On the other, the few machines still in operation kept fighting with their last remaining strength. Communicating without shouting had become almost impossible. The water rushing in, the rising steam, and the machines falling silent. One after another told Joseph Bell that the end was drawing near. Yet not one of them abandoned his post. But why? What kept them there? Was it their unwavering devotion to the profession they had dedicated their lives to? Or was it a sense of duty so powerful that it outweighed even the fear of death? The Titanic was now yielding to the will of the ocean. The groaning steel, the roar of rising steam, sounded like the final breath of a dying giant. The massive ship, stretching 269 meters, was being pulled by her own immense weight into the dark waters of the Atlantic. One system after another fell silent. The beating heart of the great ship was slowly coming to a stop. And inside the engine room, Joseph Bell and his crew were only minutes away from becoming names history would never forget. April 15th, 1912. The Atlantic Ocean claimed Joseph Bell forever. What was said during those final moments inside the engine room will never be known. Joseph Bell's body was never recovered. What did he feel, knowing that only minutes remained? What thoughts crossed his mind in those final moments? The answers sailed into eternity with him. Those who survived later recalled that Joseph Bell and his crew never abandoned the engine room. They remained at their posts until the very end, and their sacrifice gave hundreds of people a chance to survive. More than a century later, the name Joseph Bell is still remembered as one of the greatest heroes of the Titanic disaster.